Chapter 9: Emotional Indicators of Sensitivities. Intellect is to emotion as our clothes are to our bodies. We could not very well have civilized life without clothes, but we would be in a poor way if we had only clothes without bodies. Alfred North Whitehead. There can be no transforming of darkness into light, of apathy into movement without emotion. Carl Jung. An anomalously high score on the H.I.S.S emotional EMO indicator scale is likely to report a high level of sensitivities in both the intrapersonal and the interpersonal realms. Intrapersonal sensitivities on the downside can result in strong mood swings with a tendency towards depression. Yeah, it's logical because dissociation, it's like zooming out. So this could also lead to depression because you are not in a fight-flight, but rather detached. As well as the likelihood of being easily hurt or upset. On the upside, they can lead to significant breadth and depth of affect, feeling, to subtle and nuanced emotional responsiveness, and to enhanced self-awareness. Interpersonal sensitivities on the downside can result in over-identification and enmeshment with others. On the upside, they can contribute to good people skills and humanitarian tendencies. Claire is emotionally very responsive, easily hurt, and highly subject to psychological stress. Oh yeah, I have that too. She experiences a wide range of feelings, is inclined toward anxiety, panic attacks, that's also typical, can feel happy and sad at the same time, yeah, and is vulnerable to feelings of depression. I think here again, your way of eating can have a very big influence on feeling depressed or not. Just feed your brain the proper food, meaning animal fats and omega-3s, and of course other animal foods like meat, eggs, fish, all of that. And on the other hand, if somebody has a high sugar intake, carbohydrates like bread, pasta, pizza, cookies, all of that, yeah, then things look a bit different, especially for highly sensitive people. Because your gut influences your brain, right? Sometimes, for no apparent reason, she experiences sudden feelings of ecstasy, bliss, peace, joy, and love. Yeah, this can come from anywhere, like somebody has thrown all those emotions at you just out of the blue, bang, and you have no idea from where. And sometimes you can experience that in nature, just like that. Something you feel very strong about, observing beauty. That's a strong one for me. She is highly empathic, but being attuned to the thoughts and feelings of others can result in her becoming emotionally overwhelmed in groups. Yeah, totally. Gee, that's just a no-no. And yeah, you end up isolating yourself just because of that. Because it can just hit you out of the blue. You feel so content and happy and calm and relaxed one moment, and suddenly, boom, there is some very different energy that you sense out of nowhere. And to regulate, to clean your system, the best way I find is just go into nature. Be there for at least 20 minutes, and this will clean your system, purify it. Knowing at a distance when someone she cares about is upset, hurt, or in danger is a common experience for her. She told me that she has put a lot of time and energy into learning how to deal with her emotions. Apparently, she has had positive results. Emotionality and emotional acuity. With respect to interpersonal emotional sensitivity, an important distinction needs to be made between emotionality and emotional acuity. Emotionality implies a tendency to be markedly aroused, agitated, or dominated by emotions. Emotional acuity suggests the ability to experience many elements in a subtle emotional palette of which less sensitive people might have no awareness. The downside of interpersonal emotional sensitivity has its genesis in emotionality. The upside arises from emotional acuity. Emotionality will be addressed here first. Where there is a greater than normal involvement of the right cerebral hemisphere in mental processes, i.e., where the brain is less strongly lateralized (LSL) than the norm, an increased level of emotionality is likely to result, and that emotionality has significant downside implications. Studies have shown that whereas activation of certain regions in the left hemisphere of the brain can result in elation, activation of corresponding regions in the right hemisphere can result in depression. Other studies have shown that individuals suffering from depression exhibit 3 times the normal rate of left-handedness. Curiously, their children exhibit 6 times the normal rate of left-handedness. Low serotonin levels are associated with depression, anxiety, violent ideation, and aggression. Left-handers, by self-description, are more introverted, aloof, cold, and quarrelsome than are right-handers. Left nostril breathers. There appears to be a contralateral connection between the nostril being used for breathing and the brain hemisphere that is more activated, are more prone to stress-related illnesses than are right nostril breathers. Hyperpigmented children are more introverted and shy, more reactive to sensory stimuli and have higher levels of immunosuppressive stress hormones than the norm. Interesting. The introduction of emotion moves this discussion out of the realm of the thought alone and into the realm of cognition. Thought has to do with reason, logic, and judgment, processes that are considered to be antithetical to emotions. Cognition, on the other hand, involves both thought, judgment, and awareness perception. Emotion, at its root level, has much more to do with awareness or perception than it does with thought or judgment. While one might think about one's emotions after they arise, and those thoughts might in turn engender other emotions. An emotional perception invariably precedes the judgments that are made about the perception. Emotional acuity and affect linking, to be discussed shortly, underlie primary process cognition, and primary process cognition in its pure form has to do with awareness, just as secondary process cognition in its pure form has to do with thought. That being so, then tertiary process cognition has to do with a cycling between or coupling of awareness and thought. Emotions are not just cognitive luxuries for those who can afford them. They are a fundamental part of what it means to be human. Without emotion, without primary process cognition, all that remains of the mind is rational, logical, analytical, secondary process cognition. And to identify that with humanness is patently absurd. To know oneself, or to know that which lies beyond oneself, one needs ready access to emotion, to primary process cognition. Secondary process cognition is cold, sterile, and numb. It is literally unfeeling, and because it is unfeeling, it excludes from its repertoire both creative experiences and transpersonal experiences, TPEs. David Kalernter, in The Muse in the Machine, discusses in depth the role of emotional acuity in both those types of experiences. The language he uses is rather academic and inaccessible, so in what follows, I have taken the liberty of incorporating a paraphrasing of his ideas into my own. Emotional acuity sets the stage for affect linking. Affect linking is the establishing of a connection between two or more, perhaps seemingly very dissimilar stimuli, specifically because each of those stimuli engender the same emotion in the perceiver. Affect linking is the basis for metaphor, for analogy, for intuition, for insight, and for the perception of similarities. A man becomes creative whether he is an artist or a scientist when he finds a new unity in nature. He does so by finding a likeness. Jacob Bronowski. Awareness grounded in emotional acuity and without the intercession of thought, that is, pure primary process cognition, is able via affect linking to transcend both the content and the meaning of the stimuli that it perceives. With that transcendence, it is only the similarities, not the differences, among the stimuli that are registered by the mind of the perceiver. In essence, the stimuli all become one. And that's a more right hemisphere perception. This ability to perceive similarities among seemingly disparate stimuli by way of primary process cognition is the hallmark of the creative process. A person who is having a creative experience upon discovering such an unexpected connection then comes, perhaps is startled back to secondary process cognition and is thus able to make constructive use of the creatively perceived connection. This coupling of the awareness of primary process cognition with the thought of secondary process cognition is what constitutes tertiary process cognition and the realization of creative potentials. Transpersonal experiences, TPEs, are closely linked with creative experiences because they have in common the dynamics that arise out of the emotional acuity and affect linking. When primary process cognition is maintained for an extended period of time without the intervention of secondary process cognition, the chain of perceived connections can become so inclusive as to result in the sensation of connectedness among all things, all life, all objects, and all events in the outside world, as well as connectedness between the outside world and the inner world of the experiencer. This is the essence of TPEs, the definition of which merits restatement here. Transpersonal experiences are experiences that occur beyond the ordinary differentiated boundaries of ego, space, and time. Experiences that suggest the essential interconnectedness and or absolute unity of all that ever was, is, or will be. Experiences that imply the existence of mind as distinct from brain, of spirit, of soul. The difference between interpersonal and interpersonal emotional sensitivity is not always obvious, and it is especially important to note that interpersonal emotional sensitivity also has many characteristics in common with transpersonal experiences. Sensitivity. An interpersonal emotional experience occurs beyond the ordinary differentiated boundaries of the ego and perhaps of space and time as well, and thus suggests interconnectedness with another person, as well as the existence of mind as distinct from brain. The association of mind with brain is generally accepted, but if an argument is to be made for a situational or provisional differentiation between mind and brain, it is necessary to look at the brain from a broader perspective than that of just the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. What is at issue here is that while the right cerebral hemisphere is indeed associated with emotions, contemporary research indicates that emotions arise in the limbic system, an older or deeper brain structure, and in the right cerebral hemisphere that brings those emotions into awareness by way of the strong neurological connections between the limbic system and the right temporal lobe. In 1949, Dr. Paul MacLean at the National Institute of Mental Health proposed the concept of the triune brain, which is a good concept. Even some believe it's outdated. I think it's a very good concept. A more balanced way of looking at the interconnectedness of the brain's various parts. His position was that while the brain indeed has three distinct components, each of which can be viewed as separate brains, those brains are intimately interconnected and they reflect humans' fully incorporated evolutionary heritage from reptiles, early mammals, and later mammals. The ancient brain, the reptilian brain, or central core, is an extension of the upper brain stem. It deals with self-preservation and preservation of the species through impulsive reflexes. The old brain, the paleo-mammalian brain or limbic system, exists in other mammals as well as in humans. It deals with emotions that guide behavior. That part here. The new brain, the neo-mammalian brain or cortex, is most highly developed in humans. It deals with memory and problem solving, with languages, reason, symbols, and culture. Each of these three brains can be thought of as having its own form of cognition, each of those forms having a different relationship with the self. At the level of the central core, cognition deals only with sensory-motor experiences. For it, the body and the environment are one and the same. At the level of the limbic system, cognition deals with both externally stimulated perceptions and internally generated imagery, both by way of the same neuronal mechanisms. It is unable to distinguish between them. At the level of the cortex, physical objects become clearly recognizable as belonging to the external world. It is only at the cortical level, then, that the brain is able to separate, to differentiate, and to make clear distinctions between that which is self and that which is not self or other. MacLean's work rendered the earlier view of the brain obsolete and led to a more accurate contemporary view that involves 5 main points. The flow of information carrying neural impulses is parallel and multiplex, not linear, thus invalidating the concept of brain hierarchy. Information is distributed, not localized. A given region of the brain serves many functions. Conversely, a given function of the brain is associated with more than one of its regions. While the cortex may contain an individual's model of reality and make self, not self, other distinctions, it is the limbic system, not the cortex, that determines the relevance of that model and those distinctions. Subjective emotional evaluations, not objective rational ones, guide and direct an individual's behavior. It is emotion more than reason that makes people distinctly human. Individuality is more nonverbal than it is verbal. Contemporary holistic researchers are beginning to think of the brain not so much as a creator of consciousness, but as a filtering mechanism that allows only a small part of a larger reality to find its way into cognition. Yep. Rather than having access only to its own constructs, the brain is seen as being able to access information from a much broader realm. The efficacy and selectivity of its filtration process is said to depend on what is called the serotonin screening mechanism, its modulation being a function of the melatonin-serotonin relationship. See Chapter 4. Current thinking holds that serotonin is released in order to dampen the brain's reaction to incoming stimuli whenever it is necessary to protect the brain from excessive perturbation. As previously mentioned, the melatonin-serotonin relationship is influenced by the pineal gland, and the pineal gland has connections with the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, which is basically the fear center or the alarm bell going off. The major components of the limbic system. Moreover, the limbic system functions as the conduit through which information from the central core is channeled to the cortex. What is being suggested then is that the limbic system functions as the regulator of the cortex. Inclusion of the limbic system moves this discourse beyond the left hemisphere, right hemisphere dichotomy, beyond the constraints of ordinary thought, and perhaps even beyond the boundaries of what has been spoken of here as cognition. It leads to the concept of consciousness and, most importantly for the purposes of this book, to issues having to do with altered states of consciousness. Chapter summary. Relative to the norm, people with less strongly lateralized brains are likely to have heightened levels of both emotionality and emotional acuity. Emotional acuity and affect linking, establishing a connection between two or more stimuli because they engender the same emotion. The ability to perceive similarities among seemingly disparate stimuli by way of primary process cognition is the hallmark of the creative process. Chapter 10. Altered states of consciousness, indicators of sensitivities. Science's biggest mystery in the nature of consciousness, about all we know about consciousness, is that it has something to do with the head, rather than the food. Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written about it. An anomalously high scorer on the H.I.S.S Altered States of Consciousness A.S.P indicators scale is likely to report a high level of sensitivities in the realms of dissociation, hallucination, sleep, wake, overlap, association, and suggestion. As will be shown, A.S.P sensitivities appear to underlie all the other major sensitivities: physiological, cognitive, emotional, and transpersonal experiences. So, it is impractical to provide a brief synopsis of their upside and downside manifestations. Suffice to say that in conventional psychiatric thinking, altered states of consciousness are generally considered to be evidence of psychopathology, which is really stupid and narrow-minded, typical. While it is true that A.S.Cs can be associated with psychopathology, it is also true that A.S.Cs can be associated with giftedness. Both sides of the issue deserve to be given equal attention. And again, left hemisphere narrow-mindedness and judgmental way of seeing things, categorizing, black and white thinking. So typical, just to label it as something negative. In responding to the H.I.S.S questionnaire, Claire reported that she sometimes had experiences of blank spells or missing time, including finding herself in some situation, but not knowing how she got there. These experiences were disconcerting, as were others in which she felt that either she or people, places, things around her had become changed, distorted, or transformed. She reported often experiencing in a nominal waking state of consciousness the feeling that her mind had left her body, dissociation. She also reported sometimes being distracted by internal voices or other sounds and having experienced other perceptions for which there were no corresponding stimuli in consensus reality, most notably strong unpleasant tastes and odors. So this is so typical for shifting one perception, the left hemisphere, into the right hemisphere perception, and then you have all these things described here. Her frequently recalled dreams are extremely vivid, also typical. The transition from the sleeping state to the waking state is for her quite lengthy, and she has regularly experienced hypnagogic perceptions, further discussed later in this chapter, chief among which are the feeling of flying through the air and waking up paralyzed while feeling the sense of a presence. Yeah, the flying dreams, those are very cool. Or just gliding without actually touching the surface beneath you. You just glide, basically. and direct where you are going just by wishing it. It's so cool. I love that state. She is a very imaginative daydreamer. Yeah, that's also something I know. And often enters a state of reverie. At such times, she experiences her subjective perceptions as being more real than real, and finds her inner reality to be virtually indistinguishable from outer reality. Donna Williams described this in a similar way, like she used the word merging with any shiny object or something that she felt she could lose herself into. And then she no longer was aware of herself, but became one with whatever object she was focused on. Incidents of the sort are the springboard for creative undertakings, such as inspirational writing, in which she feels that it is not she who is doing the creating. And this is the typical flow state. And so many songwriters say it just came through them. And all they did was writing it down. And yeah, that's the shift again into right hemisphere perception. Then you are just open for anything that wants to come through. And I bet J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter in this state too, or other writers. Their books that are so wonderful to read. Because in a left hemisphere perception, you just can't create like that. It's impossible. I'm not sure what an altered state of consciousness is because I couldn't begin to say what a non-altered state of consciousness is. In my experience, my states of consciousness are constantly changing, so at any given moment I am in what might be spoken of as an idiosyncratic or anomalous state of consciousness. Staying with the conventional term, however, I would have to say that I am almost always in some sort of altered state of consciousness. Most of the time, the altered quality is minimal, but sometimes I go way out there and am only aware of having been in an altered state of consciousness when I come back to a more ordinary state. Sometimes I'm aware that I am not aware, and sometimes I'm not. Increasingly, I can be aware and not aware at the same time. Perhaps it has something to do with parallel states of consciousness. The boundaries are very permeable. The states are not separate and distinct. I can be aware that I am not aware that I am aware. When I'm way out there, the minute I become aware of being in an altered state of consciousness, I come right back. When I'm in an altered state of consciousness, my awareness is both very heightened and very focused. What I'm aware of, I'm incredibly aware of, and everything else I'm completely oblivious to. I notice things that other people don't notice, but I miss things that are obvious to everyone else. Yeah, and anybody who has experienced these states, especially through substances, be it psilocybin or ketamine or MDMA, what have you, DMT, you can experience these states, obviously. That's a well-known fact, because you shift into a different way of attending from left hemisphere to right hemisphere perception. Yeah, but sometimes you can also have spontaneous altered states of consciousness without any use of substances, or highly sensitive people, anomalously sensitive people, can experience them on a regular basis. And then you also have autistic people, especially those nonverbal ones. They are very familiar with this kind of perception. When considered at a very simple level, consciousness can be equated with cognition. From that perspective, it can be seen as being not so much a thing as it is a process or set of mind activities, perhaps involving awareness and/or thought, that is associated with the brain. The mind activities can be compared and contrasted with two other sets of activities associated with the brain, namely environmental interaction activities and regulation of bodily function activities. Table 10.1 below helps to clarify the distinctions. Discussions of consciousness, however, seldom take place at a simple level. Once engaged in, they rapidly become exceedingly complex. A 1976 book by Julian Jaynes, entitled The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, is a case in point. Jaynes sets out to develop an unassailable definition for consciousness and simultaneously attempted to explain how consciousness originally came into being. He defined consciousness as subjectivity, self-awareness, having an awareness of one's own awareness, i.e. reflexive self-awareness, or having an internal mind space to introspect upon, and postulated that consciousness requires thought. Thought requires language, and given that only humans are capable of producing and/or comprehending language, only humans can be considered to be capable of attaining consciousness. A logical corollary to his theory would be this: since the language center, Wernicke's area, is located in the left temporal lobe, and since language, like other left hemisphere functions, is a logical, linear, rational process, consciousness itself must be considered to be a logical, linear, rational process. Because that makes no sense. In the telepathy tapes, it is the non-verbal autistics that are reported to be able to communicate telepathically because they have no language, because they are non-verbal. So they either type, but then they have this capacity. And hyperverbal people don't. So, nah. Based on his review of ancient literature, James argued that consciousness as we know it was unavailable to primitive humans until the second millennium BC. He has it upside down completely. I think it was the other way around. It is also known that hunter-gatherer people still, to this day, those who have not lost this capacity, Native Americans too, that's the way how they followed their prey, by connecting with them telepathically, sensing, and having a very, very different kind of relationship with Mother Nature, because they were not in their left hemisphere dominance, but right hemisphere dominance. So he has it upside down. Early humans, he stated, had no subjectivity or self-awareness and no consciousness. No, they had consciousness, but they were not so ego-driven. I think that was the main difference. Both cerebral hemispheres are able to understand language, but only the left is normally able to speak. Bicamerality, as described, seems more closely to parallel what is today spoken of as dissociative identity disorder, DID. Note that the primary DSM-4 diagnostic criterion for DID is the presence of two or more distinct identities or personality states, each with its own relatively enduring pattern of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about the environment and self. In Jane's defense, however, it must be stated that multiple personality disorder, as DID was then called, was in the middle 1970s an extremely rare diagnosis. Moreover, he did point to a number of parallels between bicamerality and various dissociative phenomena, including possession states, trance states, hypnosis, and Tourette's disorder. Dissociation, being an altered state of consciousness, is noteworthy. That the terms used by Janes, enhanced functioning of the right cerebral hemisphere, Wernicke's area, neuronal plasticity, enlarged corpus callosum, stimulus sensitivity, increased responsiveness to sensory deprivation, stress-induced hallucinations, dissociation, proneness, and a high level of hypnotizability all apply to the less strongly lateralized LSL brain, thereby suggesting a correspondence between A.S.P-ness and bicamerality. Jane's work provides a vitally important foundation for discussions of consciousness. With more than 20 years of hindsight to draw on, However, some modifications are in order. Bicamerality, as previously mentioned, more closely parallels dissociative identity disorder than it does schizophrenia. The dismissal as hallucinations of the right hemisphere God voices is a bit too facile. God may simply be a metaphor for the clear and compelling voice of intuition. Yeah. It is unlikely that primitive humans were completely lacking in self-awareness. I think so too. While changes in the nature of human thinking surely have occurred over time, the nature of those changes has most likely had to do with a reduction in the breadth of consciousness. As a result of the developing emphasis on rational empiricism, in the last 4 eons, humans have simply learned to suppress awareness of information arising in the right hemisphere. Yeah, I totally agree with that. That makes so much sense. The ready and possibly universal access that primitive humans presumably had to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious was driven underground. The fluid communication that early humans apparently had between the two hemispheres resulted in a mind that was single, unitary, and interconnected. They were able to think with their whole brain, not just with the left hemisphere's cerebral cortex. Wow, I mean, this is such a reduction. It is modern humans, then, whose brains are divided into 2 separate and distinct cortical compartments, who are separated from themselves. Yeah. And look where it got us. And who therefore can be thought of as being bicameral. Early humans, by contrast, are more appropriately thought of as being unicameral. The thought that is said to be required for consciousness is no better understood than is consciousness itself. It is through the use of the reductionistic approach, claiming that consciousness requires thought, thought requires language, and only humans employ language, that the basis for the argument of consciousness being exclusive to humans is established. Yeah. And I don't believe that. Language is not important in terms of consciousness. Maybe it's even a hindrance that prevents accessing other skills like telepathy, for example. What in lower mammals appears to involve thought is dismissed as instinct, defined as the ability to make a complex and specific response to environmental stimuli without involving reason or thought. Thus, by way of circular reasoning, other species become definitionally incapable of thought, and the proof that they are incapable of thought is said to lie in their being incapable of producing and or comprehending language, and that's a fallacy. That's so reductionistic. What is generally overlooked, however, is that contemporary researchers using dolphins, whales, gorillas, chimpanzees, dogs, and parrots as subjects have shown that language capabilities are not exclusive to humans. Finally, there's the question of whether or not language is truly required for thought. It's not. Temple Grandin, a woman with Asperger's syndrome, in Thinking in Pictures, highly recommend that book.
Many people have heard you discuss how your autism allows you to think in pictures and analyze things like that. Can other people learn to think the way you do? Is that possible?
Well, I'm an extreme visual thinker. Most other people don't think visually to the extent I do. Everything I think about is a picture. And I designed a ramp system going into the dip vat, which was shown beautifully in the movie with real cattle walking down a ramp that's non-slip. Because in the old dip vats, they had to take big sticks and shove the cattle under. My system, you didn't have to do that because it had a hold down rack and they just walked down, they'd step over, the center of gravity would tip over and their heads would go under because you got to get the scabies out of their ears. And that was a big innovation right there. Well, I just visualized how the animal would react. A lot of artists are visual thinkers. In one of my books, The Autistic Brain, I discuss different kinds of thinking. I'm a photorealistic visual thinker. Now, another kind of specialist brain in engineers is the pattern math thinker. There's actually scientific research to show that these two different kinds of thinking actually do exist. Other work I did really early on, it seemed obvious to me to look at what cattle were seeing. They'd stop at a shadow. They'd stop at a coat on a fence, a vehicle parked next to a fence. And then you'd move the vehicle and the cattle would go through the facility. And when I first started, I thought everybody thought in pictures. Then when I did my book, Thinking in Pictures, and I started interviewing people about how they think, and then I realized that not everybody thought in pictures. That was kind of a revelation for me.
But can people learn to think in pictures?
You can learn somewhat, but sort of look at it, if this was the full continuum, you can move it a bit, but you're not going to get one end of the continuum to the other, and I'm never going to really be a mathematical thinker.
Temple Grandin, a woman with Asperger's syndrome, in Thinking in Pictures, addresses this issue. I would be denied the ability to think by scientists who maintain that language is essential for thinking. They cannot imagine thinking in pictures, nor assign it the validity of real thought. Mine is a world of thinking, and many language-based thinkers do not comprehend. But it is such a blessing to have different kinds of thinkers. The whole continuum, as Temple Grandin called it in this interview. Moreover, the avoidance of theoretical irrelevancies requires postulating that all functional human beings have a mind and are therefore theoretically capable of attaining consciousness. Additionally, to facilitate discussion, the issues of whether or not the awareness involved in consciousness need be reflexive self-awareness, and whether or not the thought involved in consciousness need be language-based thought can also be considered immaterial. Finally, there's the question of whether or not both awareness and thought need be simultaneously involved in a specific state of consciousness at a specific moment in time, and the answer to that is postulated as no. 3 ordinary states of consciousness are generally recognized. They are waking consciousness, dreaming consciousness, and sleeping consciousness. Only waking consciousness involves both awareness and thought. The others do not. Dreaming consciousness involves thought but not awareness. Sleeping consciousness involves neither. Table 10.2 below illustrates the relationships among these states. For the purpose of this book, then, consciousness will be defined as a process arising out of one or more mind activities involving awareness and or thought or neither. Note that this definition allows for the possibility that in a specific state of consciousness at a specific moment in time, either awareness or thought or both may be absent. Note too that this definition is consonant with the list of mind activities presented earlier in Table 10.1. Altered states of consciousness. The three ordinary states of consciousness, SOEs, having been specified, it remains to do the same with the various altered states of consciousness, A.S.Cs. It is, however, impossible to do so, the reason being that most SOEs must be considered to be A.S.Cs if the term altered is taken to mean different from ordinary states of consciousness. The three supposedly discrete and differentiated ordinary states of consciousness are simply theoretical constructs and seldom, if ever, appear in their pure form. Most states of consciousness are admixtures of the waking, dreaming, and sleeping states, and because they can mix in any proportion, the number of possible combinations is infinite. A rational exploration of altered states of consciousness requires that this point simply be acknowledged and set aside. As it is used in this book, the term altered state of consciousness is intended to mean any state of consciousness that differs substantially from the three ordinary states of consciousness, i.e., waking, dreaming, and sleeping consciousness. Since the meaning of the word substantially is unspecified, both qualitatively and quantitatively, a state of consciousness can qualify as an altered state of consciousness, even if it is not able to be recognized as such, either subjectively by the experiencer or objectively by an observer. The three ordinary states of consciousness are usually defined by the characteristic brainwave patterns. Simplistically, the waking state is said to correspond to an electroencephalogram EEG beta pattern, that is, brainwaves with a frequency of 14 to 22 cycles per second. The dreaming state of an EEG theta pattern, 4 to 8 cycles per second, and the sleeping state to a delta pattern, 0.5 to 4 cycles per second. Other patterns frequently mentioned in the EEG literature include the high beta pattern, 22 cycles per second and up, said to correspond to anxiety or hyperactivity, and the alpha pattern, 8 to 14 cycles per second, said to correspond to relaxed meditative awareness. Most intermixings of SOCs involve an overlapping of one state onto another that is so minor as to be unnoticeable and asymptomatic. A complete collapse of boundaries between states with a major overlapping of one state onto another, however, can have some very interesting consequences. For example, when a waking SOC overlaps onto a prevailing sleeping SOC, sleepwalking or sleep talking can occur. Also, when a waking SOC overlaps onto a prevailing dreaming SOC, lucid aware dreaming is likely to be experienced. Of particular import relative to this discussion is when a dreaming SOC overlaps onto a prevailing waking SOC. That results in a condition known as hypnagogia. Hypnagogia is characterized by theta, predominant brain wave frequency patterns, synesthesias, muscle atomia, myoclonic jerks, a loosening of ego boundaries, extremely vivid imagery, and perceptual intermixing of stimuli from different sources. In the hypnagogic condition, the mind is not able to maintain metacognitions, i.e., it is incapable of thinking about its own thinking. It is not reflexively self-aware, and dream stimuli cannot be differentiated from environmental stimuli. The hypnagogic experiencer is incapable of thinking this is not happening or that is not real. He becomes completely absorbed in internally generated imagery and activities, loses his reality testing ability, is generally unable to distinguish that which is self from that which is non-self, and may experience his consciousness as free-floating and not connected to the brain body. And so many nonverbal autistics say they were not really aware they have a body. So they must be possibly in the state of consciousness. While it was previously believed that hypnagogia was invariably followed by sleep, that turns out to be untrue. Hypnagogia followed by waking, technically spoken of as hypnopompia, can also occur. Moreover, some individuals are capable of deliberately assessing the hypnagogic state, maintaining it for an extended period of time, and then returning to an ordinary waking state of consciousness. Ernest Hartman speaks of such people as having thin boundaries between waking, dreaming, and sleeping states of consciousness, and asserts that they have a number of A.S.P-related characteristics in common. They are likely to have atypical lifestyles and be particularly artistic, creative, be especially open, trusting, and vulnerable, have a difficult time dealing with stress, exhibit unusual sensitivities involving light, sound, emotions, and empathy, have a history of ill health, be highly hypnotizable, and have a history of transpersonal experiences. Hypnagogia results from the simultaneous occurrence of primary process cognition and secondary process cognition. It is therefore a variant of tertiary process cognition, which normally involves a cycling between primary process cognition and secondary process cognition, because hypnagogia involves not only both hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, but the limbic system as well, it is appropriate to speak of it and other cognitive processes similar to it as whole brain cognition. Whole brain cognition clearly qualifies as being an altered state of consciousness, and, to reiterate, it is characterized by slow, theta-predominant cortical brainwave patterns, especially in the temporal lobes. Brainwave frequency patterns of this sort are associated with such things as early childhood, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, temporal limbic epilepsy, dissociation, intrusive sleep disorders, creativity, meditation, hypnosis, and psi. Another brainwave factor involved in anomalous sensitivities, one that is every bit as important as predominant brainwave frequencies, is brainwave coherence. Brainwave coherence has to do with brainwaves from different parts of the brain exhibiting the same frequency and amplitude and being mutually entrained so that they operate together in a smooth, continuous pattern. The more focused one's awareness is, the more coherent one's brainwaves tend to be. In the ordinary sleeping SOC, there is very little coherence. In the ordinary waking SOC, there is more. In imaginative involvement in a creative endeavor, there is still more. And in advanced meditation, there is a very high level of coherence. Dissociation, association, and hypnosis. Altered states of consciousness can be deliberately induced under laboratory conditions through the use of hypnotic techniques and have been studied in some depth by Ernest Hilgard and others. For the purposes of this discussion, it is especially noteworthy that Hilgard identified two seemingly very different pathways by which A.S.Cs are accessed in everyday life. One of those pathways has already been encountered in earlier discussion of trauma and abuse, see Chapter 5, and can be thought of as the dissociative pathway for accessing altered states of consciousness. It has to do with avoiding aversive stimuli and involves the separation and fragmentation of consciousness. Dissociation is an involuntary automatic response to significant stressors and, being a useful survival strategy, can rapidly become overlearned and inappropriately utilized, hence its characterization as pathological. The other pathway can be thought of as the associative pathway for accessing altered states of consciousness. It has to do with approaching attractive stimuli and involves incorporation into and unification within consciousness. Association is a voluntary response to significant attractors and is a process that plays a role in such things as daydreams and fantasies, creativity and invention, intuitive insight, and transcendent experiences. The flow state, for example. Table 10.3 below sums up the differences in these two pathways for accessing altered states of consciousness. So this is really different Dissociative is avoidance. Associative is approach. Dissociative, involuntary, via stressors, and associative is voluntary, via attractors. Dissociative pathologies and associative abilities can manifest on continua of degrees from the mild to the extreme. Table 10.4 below illustrates some examples. So on the dissociative pathologies side, it is overlearned behaviors, simple amnesia, hysterical amnesias, functional paralysis, post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. On the other side, associative abilities is psychological absorption, creative immersion, deep meditation, psychic attunement, out-of-body experiences, mediumship, trance channeling. They are then able to recombine, fuse, or associate with each other in new, different, and unusual ways. In other words, while the dissociative and associative pathways for accessing altered states of consciousness might be quite different, under certain circumstances, the altered states of consciousness so accessed and the ways in which those altered states of consciousness manifest might be quite similar. Dissociation and association, separation and incorporation, fragmentation and unification are two different sides of the same coin. And that coin is apparently the currency of the realm in the entire spectrum of sensitivities. Consider, for example, that it was noted in the discussion of the cerebral cortex, chapter 8, that one of its roles was to separate self from the environment. In the discussion of the bicameral mind, chapter 10, that communications generated by the right hemisphere equivalent to Wernicke's area were separated from self and perceived as non-self. In the discussion of Brown's Basque model of dissociation, chapter 5, that behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge can all be separated from self in the appropriate state of consciousness. In the discussion of immune system dysfunctions, chapter 7, that autoimmune disorders were caused by separation of self from self and that cancer was caused by incorporation of not self into self. In the discussion of sensory sensitivity, chapter 7, that overloading from incorporation of external stimuli can be a result of the suppression of cortical filtering. In the discussion of hypnagogia, chapter 10, that metacognition becomes unavailable and the environment is incorporated into self. In the discussion of synesthesias, chapter 7, that they involve the incorporation of one sensation into another sensation being activated by an external stimulus. In the discussion of creativity, chapter 9, that the incorporation of seemingly disparate stimuli into a single perception can result in a useful new synthesis. And in the discussion of emotional acuity and affect linking, chapter 9, that the incorporation and unification of all things into one's inner world is the basis for transpersonal experiences. These observations collectively direct our attention to the point that is central to this entire discussion of altered states of consciousness, that transpersonal experiences are characterized by the mind's incorporation and unification of a broad variety of stimuli as a result of enhanced subcortical awareness and suppressed cortical thought. It follows then that awareness without thought is a forced, theoretically discrete state of consciousness complementary to the three ordinary states: waking, dreaming, and sleeping consciousness. It finds its rightful place in the upper left cell of table 10.2 presented earlier in this chapter, and is appropriately spoken of as transpersonal consciousness, TPC. That table in its completed form is reproduced as table 10.5 below. See here the four states: transpersonal consciousness, sleeping consciousness, dreaming consciousness, and the waking consciousness. From the perspective of brainwave patterns, transpersonal consciousness, TPC, appears to involve a very high level of brainwave coherence, just enough beta to maintain alertness, strong alpha, and theta. The amplitude of alpha being greater than that of theta, and a level of delta considerably greater than that which normally appears in any state of consciousness not presenting a deep sleep. Because of the strong alpha patterns involved in TPC and because of conceptual symmetry with the strong beta, theta and delta patterns involved in the waking, dreaming, and sleeping states, respectively, one might be inclined to think of transpersonal consciousness as an alpha state of consciousness, but that could be misleading. The most important brainwave characteristics of transpersonal consciousness are its high level of brainwave coherence and its anomalously high level of delta brainwaves, and not its absolutely high level of alpha and theta brainwaves. Anna Weiss in The High Performance Mind refers to this anomalously high level of delta brainwaves as the radar of the unconscious mind, and suggests that it is indicative of a mind searching for information of a different kind from that which normally registers in cortical beta thinking. The high amplitude coherent alpha and, to a lesser extent, theta waves, she says, primarily serve to maintain alertness and awareness. They function as a bridge or conduit by which information gathered by the radar of delta can be made available to the cortex for processing and recall. People who exhibit this pattern of brainwaves, which she calls the awkward mind, are, she says, extremely sensitive and highly prone to being overwhelmed by a variety of stimuli. All indications are that the brainwave pattern of transpersonal consciousness, because it indicates cortical filters, sets the stage for enormously high levels of sensitivities in all of the realms i.e., physiological, cognitive, emotional, altered states of consciousness, and transpersonal experiences. Moreover, as its name suggests, transpersonal consciousness appears to be the key to understanding the dynamics involved in all transpersonal experiences, and that is where this discussion will head in the next chapter.